Calling to order the Finance and Budget Committee meeting for March 12th. We are one short of an in-person quorum right now, but we're going to go ahead and start on public comment and then come back because we believe Councilmember Burns will be here shortly. So we will take attendance there and then, but let's start now with public comment.
Howdy. Jack Mortel, President of the Pension Firefighters Board. I passed out some packets earlier. I know this is going to be discussed in May, I've been told. But there's a couple highlights with the pension I'd like to bring up that's happened since last spoke. Sherry Rikus is now a member of your board, is also a member of our board. So I think that'll work out well. I think we had our first meeting on the 27th of last month. She told me she was duly impressed with how we're set up. And one of the big things, we hadn't had an audit in 10 years. That's an odd thing. It turns out the state dropped the ball on this. So we had a 10-year audit without any exceptions. We were as clean as a whistle. Everything was in place where it should be. That ought to put you at ease and the citizens of Evanston. When we give them the money, we do the right things with it. Then just one last thing. I handed out a packet to everyone. I'll get it to the other aldermen. And I gave one of these to Finance and Budget. I can give them a second one. It's all, will be for our presentation to the board, you guys in May. These are all exhibits. I wanted to provide them now, but they're all from like Evanston's website, Foster and Foster, Illinois Municipal League, Department of Revenue. These are all documents that are solid, but I wanted to give them to you now. So if like Finance and Budget, I'll give you an idea what we're going to present. If there's a problem with any of this, you've got a couple months to put something together. And if you've got similar documents that say that ours aren't correct, that we're showing something that's not right, you'll have a chance to prepare for that. I think that's a level playing field. But we're going to come in pretty hard May on this PPRT. I'll just let you know right now. So thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mortel. Anybody else in person for public comment? All right. So, Mike, do we have anybody online for public comment?
Unless William Smith, but I think I was to say I don't think so.
Okay, so with that, we thought that Councilmember Burns will be here soon, and the first item. So maybe if people wouldn't mind, in light of that, Councilmember Kelly had a specific question about ARPA funding and where we stood relative to unallocated funds, which is a discussion item. If everybody's okay, why don't we? I think, like the first discussion on debt, the second one on budgeted capital projects is also something we want to spend a lot of time on. If people wouldn't mind, I think we could flip to page 30 and have the discussion now on the ARPA funding. If everybody's okay with that, I don't know if we need a motion to do that, but otherwise, it's actually page 31 on here. So the question that was originally raised that Councilmember Kelly brought up, and very, very valid, is that there could be some requirements that we make sure that all of the ARPA funding is allocated by a certain date, or it might have to be returned. And this schedule on page 31 shows that there is about 600,000, there's about 1.1 million after a cancellation of one project of unallocated ARPA money. There is, if I'm reading this right, but there's quite a bit more of money between the total gross ARPA and the amount that's been expended to date. So I think we'd like to understand, relative to the question, is it correct that there is a date certain at which point any unallocated funds have to be returned? And secondly, is there also a timeline relative to the actual expenditure on the funds, relative to as law as currently exists, that they would have to be returned. So maybe if we could just have that discussion point.
Good evening, Chair, the committee members. So yes, Sarah Flex, who is our Community Development Director and handles the ARPA program, I mean, she plans to come at some point in the near future to the council too, to give the kind of status report, where we are. But what you said, Chair, is correct. I think you wanted some kind of brief discussion, so that's why we included. Initially, I was reluctant because I don't have the exact information about each of the projects and what's the status of each one of them. But yeah, around $1 million is right now unallocated. And I think the council will make the decision in the short time. In terms of deadlines, we have to have the funds encumbered by this December 2024. And then we have to spend it by December 31st, 2026.
So encumbered meaning allocated? Does that?
Allocated, yes. The
Allocated.
council
But it
approved
has to
and-
be,
And under contract, yes, they were allocated and under contract, so the process must be done, under contract.
and
yes,
spent
that's
by
the better-
12,
December 31st, 2026,
2026.
yes.
Okay.
So 2 years they're kind of giving it, for the bigger construction project or some of the other.
Okay. Yeah, Councilmember Kelly?
Thank you, Hitesh. So, right, so it has to be allocated or encumbered by the end of the year. So I guess my concern is that there's still a large portion that hasn't actually been spent, and I understand it's allocated. But what happens, say, if a project folds or doesn't go forward? I guess it would be good to have Sarah Flax just to talk about I don't have it in front of me. I think it's some 20-some million that hasn't actually been issued or, given out. So I guess it would just be nice to have an update. So I just want to make sure we don't leave any of that money on the table. And because if there, we've seen in the past, some of the funds have come back to us to understand the status of the money that has yet to actually be issued. I know it's been allocated. It's very little, reasonably little that we have still to allocate, but there is still a lot that hasn't been spent.
So if the committee wants, yes, I can ask Sarah Flex to come here first, maybe next month or month after, or it would, if it's just to the full council, I think that would serve the better purpose. So the other 4 members who are not part of this committee, the council members, would get a better idea.
That strikes
Yeah,
me
I
as
just
a
want to
re-
make,
as a-
it is a problem actually nationwide in terms of folks that, risking having to send money back. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Biggs. I'm the city engineer. I will state that knowing that this is a challenge, anytime we have a deadline like this for funding, which happens similarly in tax increment financing, we are setting up several capital projects so that we could change order the funding that's being used on the capital projects to absorb another $7 to $8 million of ARPA funds if necessary. So as an example, Independence and Larimer Park is right now set up to use $500,000 of the $1.5 million or $2 million for the park projects is already ARPA. So the remainder could be change ordered as to ARPA. So there's some capacity to absorb that into the capital program.
It would seem that, time is ticking quickly, right? So I think the council members can decide. Mayor Biss?
Thanks. I'm sorry. That was really, Laura, it's probably a question for you. That was a really helpful answer. I didn't know that, so thank you. I guess just on that point and Councilmember Kelly's question, is that pivot allowed after December 31st? Right? So we're going to have no trouble allocating all the money by December 31st of this year. No concerns there. Will some of the allocated money might be unexpended, perhaps entire projects won't happen, perhaps certain things will come in under budget, perhaps certain aspects of certain projects won't happen. As allocated money winds up not being expended in 25 and 26, can the pivot you described be executed then legally?
That would be a question for Sarah to answer.
That also might depend on the distinction between allocated and encumbered.
Yes. So allocated means that the city has decided that they're giving some money to somebody and they can put that into a report. But encumbered is it's under contract, that there is a contractor hired or something that to that effect where the money is physically under contract to be spent and you're just spending out the money for the next 2 years.
And so, to clarify, the requirement is that we have the money encumbered, so under contract. by
Under
the end of this
contract.
year.
What percentage of the money is one-time use, and how much of it is used towards reoccurring expenditures?
That also would be a question for Sarah. I only deal with the capital part of it. So there's relatively a small portion of the money is currently allocated for capital projects. But there is the capacity, because of the money that is allocated, you have to put certain things into the contract at the time of bid in order to spend ARPA funds on that contract. And there are contracts that are being set up that way for this year's construction season that are not fully funded by ARPA, but can then absorb through a change order additional ARPA funds. Those ARPA funds would then be used to reduce future bond issues.
So looking at the numbers here, we have allocated all but just under 600,000.
I think it's 1.1 million after the cancellation of the contract trade. See, there's the right-hand balance.
Okay,
I think it's 1.1.
okay,
after
got
that.
it. So we've allocated all but a million.
But there are some projects that have no spending against them. So yeah, I would, yeah, certainly April, May, it seems like we should know by the end of June, which projects do we really think it's going to be difficult to get under contract by the end of the year and really have a plan on how we reallocate this money.
And what this table doesn't show, which would be helpful, is a column showing encumbered. Right, we've got, which is somewhere between allocated and expended.
Yeah, so this is really good this was brought up, and I think it is highly urgent, right, to really know what we're going to do, particularly on these projects that show no spending to date, which some of which are individually large, and certainly we could, if we can, reallocate it to a different project and maybe think about how we might fund the projects that we have to reallocate from out of city funds later if we have the money. But, okay. So I think that the good thing, so I guess the council can decide, do they want it to be a council item or do they want us to talk about it in April? But Councilmember Kelly, I think it's very good that you highlighted this issue. It's a bigger issue than the 1.1 million unallocated. It looks like some of these projects just, I don't want to pick out ones individually, but maybe that project is delayed. So what is even the possibility of getting something under contract by the end of the year? So, all right. Is there anything else? Any other comments on the ARPA section?
Sorry, I had my hand raised. Quick question. Can we plan to have Ms. Flax at our next one? I only think because since we decide on funding regarding bonds and other, it seems like it would be helpful for us to understand this at the Finance and Budget.
I think we can handle this at the council level. We've got other items of import at this committee level. But that's just my thought.
We're not
Or
gonna
there
add
could be an initial discussion at the council and decide what they want referred to here. But, yeah, I would just try to have this conversation as soon as you could, even if it's before a month from now, on at least what the plan is. Okay, so since Councilmember Burns is not here yet, why don't we go on to the discussion of the credit card fees, if everyone's okay with that? Sure. Clayton?
Good evening, Clayton Black, Budget Manager, so I can speak to this briefly. Hitesh, if you want to pull open the memo. So this was a topic that came up during the budget process, and we agreed to bring it back to this committee for further discussion. Currently, the city does incentivize payments via credit card, given the efficiency that it creates. We don't have to worry about checks bouncing, less staff handling time. less security issues, less in-person processing whenever we're working with credit cards. While they are more convenient, the city does incur some fees related to those. We pay interchange fees to credit card companies every time a credit card is swiped on our system. We process approximately $26 million in annual credit card fee payments each year, and the data shows we pay about $1 million annually in credit card interchange fees against the $26 million that is collected. Great. And then at the last meeting, it was brought up that Skokie's credit card fee amounts that they pay are quite a bit lower than ours. We did some digging into this. Skokie processes about $5.4 million worth of credit card payments compared to our $26 million. They don't have the Parks and Rec programming or the parking that we provide as a government service, and so naturally we pay more in credit card fees than a community like Skokie. In addition to these interchange fees, which are percentage-based fees varying by credit card company, we also often pay vendor fees to the credit card, to the company that we use as kind of our third-party platform. So looking just at Passport, it's our vendor that we use for parking citations, wheel taxes, parking permits, and mobile parking. We outline the fees that we pay to that company in addition to interchange fees. These include a $1.50 per citation fee that we pay to Passport for every single citation that's entered. They get $1.50. If the payment's made via credit card, we pay a 2 to 3 to 4% interchange fee on that credit card transaction as well. Staff talked to legal. State law essentially doesn't allow us to pass on a fee any greater than what we have to pay. So we have to make sure that whatever fee we pass on, we're not making money on that. We're just recouping the amount that we pay. We provided a discussion and options in this memo. We're open to committee feedback on 3 key items. First, what fees should be passed on to the customer? Is it the interchange fees? Is it the vendor fees? Is it some combination of both? Which transaction should we pass these fees on for? Should it just be parking citations? Naturally, that's something where you shouldn't be getting parking citations, so it costs us money to issue you a ticket. Should you absorb the fee that we have to pay in issuing that ticket? Should we pass it on for all fees? It's a convenience to use a credit card. Should we pass on those fees to allow for that convenience that's allowed? Alternatively, one other option we talked about with the parking department was we can always raise parking fees to absorb these expenses as well. It would pass that out across the board. So we'd simply raise parking citations by $1.50 or raise parking citations by $5 or raise certain parking citation types by a certain amount if we wanted to just tackle that. But our memo outlines the different options and the different fees we pay, and we're open to any feedback that the committee has on this topic.
Councilmember Kelly. You might, if you're talking, you're on mute. Council.
Sorry about that. Okay, so one, I think we should not, if we are going to make any adjustments, so it was about $850,000 total that we allocated for this year for, we call them bank service fees. I would say that we definitely shouldn't do it by raising parking ticket fees. I think the whole idea is not to be passing on these credit card fees to everybody, but just to the people who choose to use them, so that if people choose to pay in another way, they can avoid that fee. So I would say if we do want to do this, and again, $850,000 also, by the way, I don't know why, but ours is, I did look at Skokie too, and yes, they do have, but even their parks is far less per capita than ours. Nobody seemed to have anywhere near like that kind of per capita fee, and maybe we do have more, I don't, for whatever reasons, but at any rate, it does seem that I would say if we are going to address this and reduce our budget this way, I think it would be the parking is the largest. We have $350,000 in the parking system management. The other large one is revenue and collections. So I would say if we're going to do it, if we're going to choose one area to do it, I'd say parking, but only by adding a charge, and to your point, whatever it is to stay under the normal amount would be. But that's what I would recommend, at least for parking maybe, and for, let's see, we have water and other operations. That's the third largest one, so.
And just to add to that,
And the idea is not to penalize everybody for credit card fees. So when we increase our budget by 850,000, we're all paying for these credit card fees. So I would say, just maybe charge fees in the parking for parking tickets for people who want to use a credit card.
So looking at the 2.25% credit card fee, I do think that's a market-based fee. That's not, so I think our higher amount of fees is driven by more people paying fees with credit cards. I don't look at it as we're in any way paying above the odds relative to credit card processing fees, which are, it's a very sticky fee. I'm sure the federal government has looked into it many times, but everyone pays about the same with little ability to negotiate. So it's a matter of how do we recoup that? I mean, a user fee is a direct, only the people that are paying it, that are paying by credit card then would pay it.
But there are communities that don't even budget this. I think Wilmette is one of them. Communities that simply don't have these line items for bank fees. They say they just absorb it in the cost. So like if they're charging, whatever they charge, that's just considered part of their total.
Well, I'm
but
sure
they don't budget it out. They don't levy it. It's not part of their levy to set aside.
They must be paying for it. There's no way that they're not paying for it. It must be buried into something else. But when they do the transaction, they're paying approximately
we run
$2.25
$26 million through credit cards each year because of our Parks and Rec programming, because of the small parking transactions that we do every day. We run a lot of money through credit cards compared to many of the other communities we looked at. Skokie reported that they only spend $5 million. They collect $5 million of payments each year via credit card. So that means they're only spending, they're paying this 2% fee too. They're paying $150,000 to $200,000 probably in this fee. They may not budget it. They may just be paying it. But since we absorb such a big cost, we definitely have to plan to pay for it too out of the money we collect.
I don't see any way of reducing our costs on this. It's just the price of doing business with credit cards. The only question is, can we raise revenue by passing some fees along to the, to the payer? Right now, we don't do that at all. Is that a correct statement?
The only fee that we do pass along is a 22-cent per transaction charge on mobile pay. So when you do mobile pay, when you use the app and do mobile pay, you pay 22 cents per transaction to help us offset the vendor costs, not these interchange.
So really the only question before us is, do we want to pass along credit card fees to credit card users?
And for what? For parking citations, for everything?
Councilmember Kelly's suggestion made sense, maybe for punitive fines, parking tickets, or whatever else.
So
where it's not excuse me, Councilmember Kelly, where it's not something that a citizen is obligated to do. It's, they found themselves in noncompliance. We want to disincentivize noncompliance. So another $1.50 on top of a $25 or $75 parking ticket might not be terrible. That's all.
Yeah, part of that difference could be, they're not charging for parking and whatever. There could be, but we've made we've made the decision to charge for parking, so it's a cost associated with it. So this is not an action item for us, it's just input. Anybody else have any comments? But I'm not sure anybody's going to not pay with their credit card that does now. Not that we're looking to soak them, but that is a real cost. That is a real cost of using the credit card in the transaction. So and a sizable amount of cost that the city is absorbing now that could just be redirected as a user fee for people that do choose to pay on credit card.
Yes. So I'm generally
I
hearing
had my
that
hand up. David, can I just ask
sure,
a question?
Sherry. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, is there, again, I don't know, but is there any way as an option for Zelle for people to pay their credit card, the parking tickets or things like that? Because then we don't get charged a fee for that.
No, we are not set up for that. So the credit cards and some of the other platforms, right? Luke would know, Stripe and what others.
Yeah, because I did that for a nonprofit I was in, and we got a lot of people doing it through Zelle, and it was pretty easy to set up on the bank account, so.
Sure. Good evening, Member Rikus, Luke Stowe, City Manager. We are actually looking at a new payment platform system, and some of the payment platform systems that we're looking at might be able to accept things like Venmo, for example, and the per transaction fee for Venmo or debit, for example, debit cards the same way, would be a lower transaction than a traditional credit card transaction. So as we look at new payment platforms, there might be opportunities there.
If I could add on that point, though. Sherry, I'm sorry, were you going to say something? I think that it's.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you, and I would lean towards just charging on the tickets, the punitive charges if we were going to charge on anything.
In terms of directing people towards debit cards, I personally have a problem with that because they don't have the same level of user security that a credit card does. You don't have the same level of protection. If you have unauthorized charges on your credit card, we've all had them, I'm sure, and you have good legal protections, and you're generally able to get those taken off. A debit card is, I believe, a much different burden to get an unauthorized charge off of your card. So we could have someone talk about that more, but there are downsides to using debit cards relative to just the protection of the consumer. Now, some people, if they only have it, maybe we can allow it, but to actually incentivize people to use credit cards, I think there's more to think about on that. So.
Chair Livingston, if you want, we had a couple outstanding ARPA questions. Sarah Flax is here in case we want to ask a couple questions on ARPA.
Sure, I think we should go pretty quickly there because I think this bond discussion is going to take a while.
Hello, Sarah Flax, Community Development Director. What can I help you with about ARPA?
So our questions related to, we understand we have to get unallocated funds allocated by the end of the year, but also that needs to be contracted or encumbered by the end of the year. It appears that some of these projects are behind. So what is our plan to make a call soon on which projects we believe we need to reallocate the money, because there's a significant risk that we're not going to be able to encumber that money by the end of the year. And it might be some tough decisions, but just looking at some of these projects, I know that some of those are delayed. And so it might not be feasible anymore to use the ARPA funding for that. So how do we make that call?
Well, we're working with everybody to find out where they are, because if they are not going to have a contract, and this is especially for the capital ones, the things called subrecipient agreements, which are for programs, are great. You have a subrecipient agreement, you're good.
That counts as encumbered.
Yep, that counts as encumbered. One of the things that isn't clear in Treasury's guidance, or lack thereof, is does a grant agreement count as encumbered? Because that is, arguably that is something that could be legally, it's a legal agreement, but they haven't used that term. So what we're looking at for capital projects is to have a actual contract. Now, I think we're going to be okay on some of the big ones that are sitting out there, Family Focus Rehab, for example, and also the YMCA. Where we have some concerns are things like Northlight. Their schedule is probably very different. And in cases like that, we can reallocate. We've worked together with our public works people where we have in our contracts that ARPA could be one of our sources, so we've made it obvious, and we can switch money and put it into things like that. If we were to do that with any of our grantees or people that we've made organizations we've made commitments to, a possibility would be to say, okay, we're going to take ARPA and use it for our purposes, and do we still retain some commitment of some other source of funds? So can we flip out funds? So that's what I think we need to look at doing based on what the City Council feels is we need to stay committed to. I think we'll be in pretty good shape. Most of the participatory budgeting, well, all of the other participatory budgeting things are being looked at. And we are pushing people on projects for the economic development, like some of the Independence Park dining area and stuff like that. So we're trying to get all those into some contractual form. Okay.
Leslie?
How much of that is how much are one-time expenditures versus ongoing? What percentage?
When you say one time, what do you?
Just one-time use.
Well.
Versus ongoing expenditures.
What do you, give me an example because do you consider a capital project a one-time use? Which ones are you? Because to me, that is it's not a program, so it's a one-time use.
I guess that's my question. So like for example, the living room, a one-time use, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Versus how much is going to ongoing expenditures?
Well, we have a lot that is one-time use. I mean, when you think of it, the $3 million for.
Right, I was just wondering if you had a percentage breakdown.
I don't have it broken down that way because it's not a reporting format that we do. I could probably put that together, but not really on the fly.
So I think, like we said, there needs to be quick follow-up on this, and we should have a timeline of when we're going to start making calls that we're moving away from some projects and others, because it can't be chaos towards the end of the year. I would say by the end of July or so, we should know, hey, this project is sufficiently not developed that we're going to reallocate the money, or whatever the timeline is. But why don't we have either here or with council, or start that discussion in April, because it's going to be some difficult discussions that we think you're behind and we have to reallocate the money because we have these requirements.
And we're working on that with everybody. But another thing that just be aware of is we're also looking at how much money we have under replacement revenue still, because one of the things we can do is flip money and use it just for basic city expenses.
I guess one of my concerns is, there's sort of the one-time versus recurring. If a large percentage is recurring, then that's sort of a permanent increase to the budget.
Well, not if it's a subrecipient agreement. For example, the $810,000 that we're doing with the subrecipient agreement to Connections, there is no plan to keep that going, and that's one of the reasons.
Wouldn't be recurring.
Correct, that would not be. So we don't have much of anything that is truly recurring, because even the city programs that we're funding, we don't expect those to carry on past.
Even like sidewalks, that kind of thing?
No, none of those things are expected to carry on. Based on that, nothing is recurring. We're not funding anything right now that we intend to fund in the future once ARPA is gone.
So I think Councilmember Kelly had a comment, and then I think we do need to move on from that. Again, we want to start talking more soon about what's going to be the process, and we can answer some of these questions there. But Councilmember Kelly, I think, had her hand up. Okay.
I'm not sure if I did, but yeah, I appreciate knowing what our deadline is to make some decisions and how that's going to work, to ensure that we do effectively allocate and encumber our ARPA funds. I also had a question. We don't have to go over it now, but in the 2024 budget, I don't have it in front of me, but the pages on ARPA, I've looked it over, I've showed people, the numbers don't really seem to make a lot of sense on the graphs and the charts, but we can look at that another day. But those pages, it says like the funding balances, the fund balances, it'll say like 3 million, then expenditures. It looks like we got 60 million. It just doesn't, the different expenditures and amounts, and again, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but I think that those need to be reviewed, the pages that are dedicated to ARPA in our 2024 budget.
One of the things that could cause that is carryover. In other words, if we didn't expend it one year.
So I think there's more discussion to have here. We're not going to get through it. Jonathan, did you have just a
couple of questions on two line items here? We've allocated $2 million for lead service line replacement. that's certainly going to be an ongoing program.
Well, but, I mean.
Not with ARPA money.
Not with ARPA money, so.
Once the ARPA
yeah.
money's done,
Right.
we're going to have to find other money to keep doing that.
Right.
Right, so it's a permanent increase in the budget, would be my point. You're going to have to fund that somehow on a
Well,
go-forward basis.
We're lucky that we can use ARPA for some of it, but we're going to have to do that no matter what.
I just think a point of information real quick. I think really, Leslie, what I think you're trying to get at, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just if we created any new positions that we are now funding with ARPA.
Right,
Because
is there going to be?
Because everything else, but you described it as things that we have to pay for every year, and we're just choosing to use ARPA to fund that this year.
Right.
But I think what you're talking about, like, have we created any new positions that we are funding with ARPA?
Right.
And we have not
Yeah.
been doing that. That also is one of the reasons not to put rent assistance into our general assistance and expand
I
that.
believe some
because
of the
then,
participatory budgeting projects were kind of filtered out because of that. And then one, so I think we're done with that one. You mentioned Northlight as a concern. So is our commitment to them not considered encumbered?
we have a grant agreement, but they don't have a contract. So right now, as I say, we're not sure.
So we're not sure if a grant agreement counts as
Correct.
encumbered.
There is nothing in,
Could that be restructured as a subrecipient agreement?
well, I could look at it. It doesn't really fit a subrecipient because
So I think
a
that's a good
subrecipient
one to
agreement-
talk about, and we'll talk about it, further.
can work on
like
all that.
in April. But great, thank you for jumping in here and giving us more insight, but this is a critical thing to get behind and prioritize. Thank you. Okay, since Councilmember Burns is now here, and we have we need to take roll formally? Okay.
We'll start on line. Councilmember Kelly,
Here.
Committee Member Rikus,
Here.
Councilmember Burns,
Here.
Committee Member McMillan,
Here. Sorry.
Councilmember Nguyen, Councilmember Nusma,
Here.
and Chair Livingston.
Here. Okay, and we already had public comment. Hopefully, everyone had a chance to read the minutes. Any comments on the minutes from the prior meeting? Okay. Motion to approve them? Motion to approve the minutes?
Second.
Second, okay.
Taking roll again, starting on line. Councilmember Kelly, approval of the minutes.
Yes, approved.
Okay. Committee Member Rikus,
Approved.
Councilmember Burns,
Aye.
Committee Member McMillan,
Approved.
Councilmember Nguyen, Councilmember Nusma,
Aye.
Chair Livingston.
Aye. Okay. Back on track here. Thank you. So the first item, or the only item for formal consideration, is our guidance relative to a potential general obligation bond issue. So, turn to. Yep. Thank you.
Yes, we put together just a few slides, and the slides are essentially just the memo, but condensed to a slide format. I'm going to go through those briefly, and then we have Anthony Maselli on the line from Spirit Financial, and then I'll also turn over to Hitesh to answer questions too. If possible, I'd love to get through the presentation. It's only 10 slides, and then we can open the floor for questions. So as you know, we've taken these to this committee, but the City Council's approved 3 reimbursement resolutions since we last issued bonds. Those were in 2022, 2023, and then earlier this year. These totals are $10.9 million from 22, $17.7 million from 23, and $29.2 million from 2024. What this allowed us to do was authorize spending on a potential future bond issuance. So it allowed us to eventually go back and issue bonds for these projects, and meanwhile, the City Council has approved many of these projects, and all those projects are outlined in the packet that is attached. Since we last issued bonds back in 2021, we've retired $34.1 million in GO bond principal and related interest, including $17.4 million in unabated GO bonds. And unabated simply means that those are bonds that impact our property tax levy that we pay back for through the property tax. We've retired $34 million since those were last issued. So as I said, the City Council has approved many of the projects that were within these bond issuances, and we've continued to pay our bills and meet obligations to make sure that these projects are moving forward. We've taken several measures to pay those bills, as we've talked about with this committee. First, we've used cash that's been on hand that will eventually be invoiced for from the Illinois Department of Transportation. We had about $8 million in cash that we will eventually owe to IDOT for projects that are completed, but they're very slow at billing us for the work. And so we've drawn down that cash and used it to keep these other projects moving forward. We transferred $3.3 million in excess general fund reserves. We've talked about this all year last year for projects that came in over budget, specifically the animal shelter, the skate park, Main Street improvements, and maybe one or two others where we simply moved excess general fund reserves to pay for those project overages. And more recently, we've started using cash advances from other funds where we are legally allowed to move funds from one fund to another as a temporary loan or advance in order to make those payments. As a result of doing these things, the CIP fund has gone from a cash balance of $9.1 million on January 31st, 23, and now we're in the negative at negative $275, $980 here in 2024. So we've done a lot to really draw down that cash balance, as we've talked about with this committee. So at this time, we wanted to bring it back to the Finance and Budget Committee to seek some direction on $18 million in funding for 2022 and 2023 projects that were authorized in those bond resolutions. City Council, so combined, the amount for projects in those bond reimbursement resolutions was $25.1 million. The City Council has obligated $16.1 million of that amount. So we've obligated far less than what the resolution said we were authorized to go out and enter contracts to do. Of that $16 million, we've only spent $7.7 million. Well, we're under contract for $16 million total. And so we know we're going to be making these other $9 million in payments since we're under contract and the projects are ongoing. And there's an additional $2 million of this $25 million where we believe we'll go under contract for a project. And those projects you can very clearly see in Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2 of this item. So we're looking for direction on this $18 million, of which 16 is obligated and 7.7 has been spent. On the water side, it's a similar story. So over the past 3 years, we've taken two specific measures to pay our bills on water projects. We've used the entire reserve cash balance. We went from a cash balance of $8.6 million on January 31st, 23 to negative $1.7 million in 2024. This does fluctuate a lot. So while it's a big negative number, we do a lot of spending on very big capital projects where we may pay an invoice for $4 million for the water intake project, for example. That's we use a revolving loan to pay for that, so we may be waiting for reimbursement for that really big payment we made because we're financing those projects through loans. So this cash balance does fluctuate quite a bit as you see those big payments get made towards those projects. And so again, the 2023 reimbursement resolution had $3.5 million in water projects. The one approved earlier this year had $9.8 million in water projects. And there's an additional $5.2 million in projects that haven't been approved through a resolution yet. Those are outlined in Exhibit 3, and Laura can talk a bit about those as well. So at the end of the day, we're seeking direction. Both of these funds have now gone into the negative. We've drawn down the cash balance. In the agenda item is a cash and investment summary for all of our funds. In this slide, we've pulled out just those funds where there is some ability to do loans and transfers and advances to pay our bills. Not best practice to sweep fund balances from one fund to another. Shouldn't take your solid waste fund balance, for instance, to pay your capital projects. Not great practice. But we can do some form of advances within these funds because they're controlled by the city and not necessarily restricted by federal or state agencies. We can't take our ARPA cash balance, for example, and use it to pay our bills on capital projects. It's very heavily regulated by the Treasury, as you all know. So you can see on the far right, these specific 12, 13 funds had a cash balance of $83.3 million on January 31st, 23, and just 1 year later, sitting in a cash balance of $65.3 million. So you can see the negative cash balance in water and the negative cash balance in capital improvements now. And you can see the general fund cash balance has gone from $56.2 million down to $44.5. Very similar to the deficit that we talked about when we shared our projections on the general fund earlier this year too. So we're drawing on the cash balance and as directed by this committee. So at this time, we are seeking direction from the committee regarding the timing and amount of bonds, use of our line of credit, which we have not used yet, $15 million, or the identification of any other funding source. So that concludes the presentation, and I can entertain questions, as can Hitesh, as well as our financial advisor that's on the line.
Thank you, Clayton. That was a very good summary. So I think maybe in starting to think about this, we have two pockets of funding, of debt needs. We have the abated or the water fund amounts that would be paid for through water rates. And I believe those, per one of our discussions, those rates did increase in anticipation of having additional bonds. So I think we, in our prior discussions, really already made the decision relative to the water bonds. Rates have increased. That's how we're going to fund them. I would imagine that is somewhat less, I don't know if controversial is the right term, but those will be paid for off the water fees. The water fees have already been increased. We're just kind of completing that plan is one way I would look at it. And then with respect to the general obligation funding, if those amounts are not funded by a bond, then they would have to go back to the general fund, which would use up the available general fund reserves, which were the excess reserves, I believe, would, the current guidelines or current projections would be depleted probably by the end of the excess reserves at some point next year or so. So if we don't do the bonding on these capital projects, then we're just going to create a problem within the general fund. But that's certainly up to a whole lot more discussion, but I just wanted to make the point that I don't think there's a lot of there should not be a lot of controversy relative to the water side. We already said we want to speed up the pace of water main replacement. We have the big project going on. The rates have been adjusted. Seems like that one is very straightforward. The one that we need more discussion about is the priorities and the amounts on the GO side. So would people agree with that comment or thought?
In general, yes. Specifically on the water, let's take that for an example. We're going to have to at some point issue a bond. The question in my mind is when exactly do we do that? And looking at what might happen to long-term bond rates over the next few months, might it be in the long run more prudent to use our line of credit to get us through the next few months if we can save money in the long run if rates go down? So what does your crystal ball say?
I'm a little confused. So I thought the increase in the water rate was going to take care of this. Am I wrong?
It'll pay off the bonds that we eventually issue.
Okay.
Right. Otherwise, we'd have to pay all of it.
You're saying it'll pay for the amortization.
It'll pay for the principal and interest.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, yes, I can talk about it, but I think I would defer it more to since we have our financial advisor, Anthony Missilli from the Sphere Financial. So I would let Anthony, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to predict where rates will be in the next few months. I shared some information with Hitesh regarding the rates as of right now. On a 20-year bond issue for the city, we're roughly just under that 4% level for a general obligation issue. Rates have been relatively stable so far this year. Last time we spoke was in January, and we discussed the turnaround from October, November of 23, and kind of a dramatic decrease in interest rates from that point. Since that time, since January through today, it's been relatively stable. Trading within, I would say, a 20-year issue within that 3.5, 3.6 to 4% range. Their inflation numbers came back today, basically in line with expectations. I think if that continues, there's some stability in the market. If inflation drops, I can see potentially rates falling. We have some uncertainty in November with presidential election. I'm not sure what will come from that, whether it be good or bad in terms of interest rates, but it certainly is something to kind of keep our eyes on. If this does go that far into the year. But, you know, as said, as of now, rates have been stable. The market has actually been, there's been decent demand. We've seen, you know, sales get done at attractive levels, you know, all things considered to where we were last year.
How much of a decrease would have to happen in order for us to justify borrowing at a higher rate in the short term? There's two variables in that equation. One is the interest rate and one is the amount of time. So.
Right. And it's actually, what's our current rate? It's not a tax advantage facility, right? So it's substantially higher.
So yes, I mean, if you look at the numbers, let me just throw out there that if we need the money, say that IDOT bills us tomorrow, right, $7-8 million, and if I had to pay that, line of credit would cost us 100 basis point plus the rate. So it would be like we are already making 5.5% roughly on our deposits. So you have to simply add like roughly 100 basis point to that, 6.5. You know, that would be the temporary. Yes. The rate is 4%. Yes, I mean, ideally, and particularly when I look at our 2020 and 2018-19 bonds, you know, and even in 20, I think we issued at 1 3/4. Anthony, you can just correct me for 21. So yes, I mean, 4% is a higher rate because we are locked in, and even if we buy the call after 8 years, which would cost us some extra money, but you are locked in for 8 years at 4% rate, you know. And I know in the past I heard from a couple of committee members that, yes, that's why we have the line of credit. But I said something to this effect to the council or this committee even 6-8 months back that, yeah, I mean, we think that rates are going down. And as Anthony mentioned that, yeah, it's been stable for the last 3 months. So, I mean, it's anybody's guess, and particularly as, yeah, the external factors like presidential election later this year, we don't know what would be the, you know, market trend. So, yes, if I tell you right now that, yeah, let's use the line of credit and we keep on paying 6.5% for 6-8 months, it's a lot of money. So that's where, yeah, I mean, either you say that, okay, let's kind of slow down on the CIP side, spending-wise. That's the one option, even though those projects have been approved or some of them are already in the pipeline, so we can't stop midway. Second thing is, yes, we take a chance and say hopefully even the rates would come down to at least in 6 months. I heard the Feds last that, yes, there could be a rate increase, but they don't say, which is very important, that how soon and how much, you know. If you do 25 basis points after 6 months versus you do 50 basis points in the next 6 months.
So both Councilmember Kelly and Member Rikus have their hands raised. If maybe probably continue some of this discussion with them. But Councilmember Kelly.
Thank you. So I guess a couple of things I would want to know. I know over the past couple of years in the memo it says that a variety of means were used to cover expenses in lieu of issuing the bonds. Could we get a breakdown of where the money came from? If it came from surplus, if it, where was that? Was it short-term loans, or was it from surplus accounts? Is that there in the package how we covered?
Right. So if you see that one of those things is helping us in terms of cash is the IDOT bills, which haven't come due. So that's one thing. Second thing is the City Council approved $3.3 million for 5 or 6 different projects, either new or most of them overages, right? So that was paid as a transfer. So it's like a free money, general fund. Then, during the period...
I would call it a use of the excess reserves in the general fund, because that was viewed as being permanent.
Okay.
Right?
I'm correct myself.
But it used up excess reserve in the general fund.
Right. Yes. Use of general fund, excess reserve. And then, I mean, look at that. I mean, when you say that 275,000 negative, I mean, does it work in my personal life? Okay, can I have a negative balance? No. So who is providing that loan, kind of, you know? And that's the general fund. Is funding that, and that's why we still keep on paying the bills. And as the other thing you have to keep in mind that even if you say, yes, let's issue the bond, I go to the council, by the time we get the money, it's almost 3.5 months when I would see the money, even if the process kind of continues on and stays on track.
Thank you. And then I had one more question regarding the water. Can you tell us roughly how much is, I know we had been transferring at least 4 million out. How much are we transferring out of the water fund?
I think that's the right amount.
It's the same from year to year?
Yeah.
4 million?
Yeah, because the big one is the investment on that, the plant asset, so that's the biggest one out of that 4 million.
Okay, and then I had that question that I think I asked last time, and I think you were going to get back to me on it. On, I think it's page 51 of the budget, it says, you know, we were noting how the IMRF is fortunately in a very good standing with about over 50 million in the black, so to speak. I know it's not our money, but it did say under that, it said, note the sewer fund, water fund, solid waste fund, parking fund, and general fund have been used to liquidate IMRF pension liability. So when I think of liability, I think of like...
Right, so it is in the, yeah, I mean, first it's, yeah, Councilmember, it's in the audit report. So we have the employees charged to the water fund, sewer fund, fleet fund, parking fund. And under the GASB requirement, when we have to liquidate the long-term debt other than the, what do you call, GO bonds, like compensated absences or like the contribution of employers or insurance premiums, we have to report this. So that's how that's the kind of technical language which we call. But what it represents is, in a simple terms, is that yes, the employer is contributing for the IMRF portion, employer contribution portion, some in sewer, some in parking, some in general fund, some in parking, and likewise.
Okay, thank you. So that's considered liability. Okay, just that's what that reference is there, to liability then, just the cost that we pay per employee towards the IMRF?
Right, employer's portion, you know, right now I think, what's the rate of contribution? 3% is the employer contribution rate.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then I have one more question regarding our cash and investment reports. We get a first, a second, and a third quarter. So we got a cash and investment report in October. It was as of September. We got it a month later in October. Can't we get one also for a fourth quarter?
Yeah,
so I know you presented this one here. I realize that, but the one that's standardly produced and loaded, the same type of report that's available the first 3 quarters. If we could get that, I mean, this is
Sure.
March already. I'm wondering if we couldn't also get the same report in January that would reflect year-end December 31st.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes we just wait because of a lot of audit adjustments, including the what we call the interfund transfers between two funds due to due from. But yeah, we can definitely put that out on the website.
And can we do that routinely? So the same way you give us the October cash and investment report, that's the third quarter, you know, as of September, can we get that one in January then routinely for December?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sherry had her hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to address timing of this because I've been in this business for 40 years and you can always expect the unexpected. And we have no idea if interest rates are going to go lower or higher. They could go higher on the short end and not change on the longer end. And using the line sounds like that's pretty expensive versus the 4%. So I would advocate if we decide to do a bond offering, I don't think we should start, you know, second guessing where interest rates are. Anthony, I don't know if you agree or not, but if we need the money and we need to pay the bills, we should go with the best rate we can get at that time.
Leslie.
I mean, I guess there are some expectations. If you look at the market share, and you know this probably better than I do, they are starting to, you know, the market's pricing in cuts in July, starting the second half of the year. You know, I'm all for slowing down capital spending if we can. So that would be my recommendation. You know, the line, Stu, you said it's at 6.5, is that right? Or 7.5?
100 basis point plus whatever the rate, yeah. So roughly right now it
Plus
would
SOFR,
cost me.
or at SOFR plus 100, or? I mean, I prefer to, of course, avoid taking on any more debt, but, and I do think rates are going to fall in the second half of the year, would be my view.
So a lot of people are struggling with this now. I mean, we are at ITW, not struggling, but trying to figure out. Everyone's done sort of what what I think the city has done well, which is delay bond issuance until rates got, out of the peak into a more normalized structure. There are record issuances of debt now, so the market is speaking. People are, I don't know so much on the municipal side, but the corporate side, it is, the last few months have been very high relative to issuance. I completely agree with Sherry that you never know the future. We talked about this a little bit before, but the rates are inverted now. So people talk about the Fed cutting. Well, they're cutting, the market has already spoken that long-term rates, they didn't drop anywhere near, where they were. And most people think they're absent an intervening horrible crisis. They're not going back to where they were. But that, the market, long-term rates are market-led, short-term rates are Fed-led, and you get a line between those. So the Fed is yet to cut, but that's going to impact the shorter, the in years on the proposed bond issuance. The out years, one could argue, are probably close to long-term normalized. And to what Sherry said, lots going on in the world, lots going on with the election. Markets open now. Rates are a lot better than they were. What I would say is you never want to be in a position where you are forced to do a bond deal, that you're out of liquidity and you are forced to just take whatever rate is available. We should be in a normal course, and the amount would go up or down, but normally you would expect us to do a bond deal every year or so, and so you sort of average everything out if you're regular. But we had these very extraordinary times pretty recently, 6 months ago, where the 10-year rate shot up to 5%, and no one would have wanted to have done a bond there. So it's it is not as good as it was, for sure. I think we're not talking about doing something like a very large bond issuance to pay for pensions or anything like that. We might have wished we did, but we didn't. We weren't organized around it then. I'm not sure we would have wanted to have done it. But regardless, we're not talking about a discretionary, incremental, large amount of debt that we're saying now is the time. We are saying these are normal expenses. We know we have to do the water mains and those projects. We've approved these these capital projects. You're continuing, I think, to look at what's the minimum amount we need to do. That's kind of what you're asking for. And if the, the markets are open, the rate's a whole lot better than it was. Could it be a little bit better in 6 months? Yeah, but we'll probably issue more bonds 6 months after that, hopefully bringing debt down over time. But we're not in a position where we can just pay off like we have $30 million and not issue anything, right? So I would be probably closer to where Sherry is of we have a need, it's a demonstrated need, it's not excessive, let's take advantage of the market as it exists today.
Can I ask one follow-up question? Do you think we'll be amending the budget?
Not necessarily, because these projects are already approved, which are expenses. So it's
and those were in the budget that we approved, things like Little Beans and
not the Little Beans, but all of the projects which we showed here under the resolution, the
I mean, how are we not going to have to amend the budget if now that we're going to have this lease and we're going to have Little Beans and all those things?
I mean, Little Beans, yes. And again, remember this thing. It has to be amended at the fund level. So if we have some corresponding savings of 2.5 million or 3 million somewhere else, and if it's still under the approved limit, then I don't have to come to the city council for approval. I don't have to come to the city council for individual project in that sense. If like the general fund, which has funded the Little Beans, but if we have some other savings in general fund of say $3 million and brings the total expenditure in general fund at the year end under the budgeted expenditure approved by the city council.
How is that going to happen with the new lease? I mean, how could that
I'm
possibly?
just telling you the thing, yes. I mean,
so should we, it sounds to me like we should be expecting an amended budget.
But it is too early right now. We are in March for second week, so yeah, I don't want to.
I mean, how is it too early when we know there's a couple known no's? no knowns.
I mean, we never know in the, like, we still see the kind of turnover, employee turnover, the vacancies and all that kind of thing. We have, see this time, unlike the last year, we have all increases budgeted at the right levels. Last year, we had only budgeted 4.5%, and we ended up giving a lot higher. So, yeah, we are pretty good at that. And so if we have some savings there, oh, yeah, that's the other thing. We don't pay the lease amount until 16 months in 2016. Yeah, February 2016.
What about 2023 budget? Are we going to be amending that one too? Like we did last year? We are.
For general fund, at least. Because, yes, the biggest one was the personal cost, where we had budgeted 4.5% increase for all. We didn't know employee contracts. It all happened during the year after the budget was approved. And obviously, everyone got like 11, 14, 18, whatever they are.
But this bond issuance is not, what we're talking about here on the bond issuance is not related to a budget.
No, I know. I was just wanting to find out where we are versus the budget, just because we're the
So I
Finance
think
and Budget Committee.
Sherry has her hand up.
Yeah, I just want to go back, Leslie, what you said, which was a good point, is I just want to make sure, you know, if we approve the dollar amount, that that's really for projects that will be completed that we are going to need to pay, because we can always issue less now and then issue more later if these projects aren't going to be timely, or if we don't need all that money. I don't want to just issue it and hold it for later. So I just want to make sure we're matching expenses with the bond.
I mean, absolutely. And if you want, we can, when we come back to the city council, we can come with the precise amount. I mean, consulting with Lara, that yeah, this would be the amount where the projects are already ongoing, and we are going to spend X dollars, you know, in next 12 months. And yeah, we can start with that kind of a minimum amount of bonds required now in next 12 months.
Jonathan, you had your light.
I think Sherry just asked my question. Do we have to do the whole amount now, or can we do some now and some later?
We can do later on too. It's just that some of those costs are incremental, but not much in terms of bond issuance costs.
If what Leslie's saying is true, that the rates do come down later, then great.
Yep.
But I think we're largely just replenishing the money we've spent. You've taken these sort of unusual measures to borrow from other funds, to spend down well below reserve levels and things like the CIP fund. We need to replenish those.
Right.
And
I think someone asked me, I think, was it Member Rikers, that, yeah, how did we do the bonds in the past? I mean, how did we fund the CIP? I mean, we issue the bonds every year, and right around 10, 15 million, to, you know, based on the CIP requirement. We never use the general fund reserve, you know.
So if I could ask Anthony a question, you know, a municipal bond like this, you know, it's not a 20-year bond where all the principal is due at the end, which would be more like a corporate bond, right? It is, if there's a level of debt service, is there not a structure, okay, it's the shorter term rates impacted by the Fed that have not fully adjusted to market rates. Is there not a do we have to have principal maturities in these early years? Can we not have maturities in, say, the first 5 years?
I mean, we did the Crown bonds with only interest payment for the first 5 years, and 25-year bond.
Right.
So it would cost more, yes.
But the rates are lower, right? The rates are lower on those shorter maturities. And then I don't understand why. I mean, why do we have 5% coupons? I know we get a premium for that, but that's almost, you know, a full percentage point above the effective rate. So I would just, this could be followed up, I think, with the council, but I would say, look, is there an option to take advantage more of the longer term maturities that the market has already adjusted the rate further down, not have to borrow shorter term money that is actually in this inverted yield curve environment more expensive?
I mean, I would just say this before I give it to Anthony. I mean, yes, if you see, we had like years where we got almost $2.5 million premium, which is not considered bond payable, you know. It's like a free money, but it comes at the interest.
Well, it's not free money, you're paying a higher rate. I mean, right. The present value is the same.
But Chair, what happens is, if I end up giving 5% on the longer end, the bonds are callable after 10 years. So I have opportunity to refinance those 5% coupons, or, you know, in the long rate. Yeah, I cannot do it before that. So sometimes we go with the higher premium and end up giving the, you know, the higher coupon rate in any, long years. And that helps because, I mean, I've seen that most years we have refinanced the rates. The rates were better than what we paid.
So, I'm sorry, to clarify, Robert Crown, those were 5%?
No, Robert Crown, we did not pay the principal for the first 5 years. That's
Right,
how
but those aren't at 5%, are they?
I'll have to check, but I don't think so because the rates
Those
were
are those
2.5.
501c3 bonds? Is that something we're contemplating in the future, or?
I mean, you have to qualify for that, right?
Pardon?
I mean, you have to qualify for that, 501c3. I mean, we did Robert Crown because we have those certain, those rights with certain organizations where they get in lieu of the donation.
Right, what was the benefit of that? I mean, was that something you looked at for the the dog shelter? Or
I mean, we got that upfront money, the donations, the big times. And so that was a big thing to do, kind of, which went to.
No, I know that, but what's the benefit of a 501c3 bond?
No, we have to do then 501c3 if you have these kind of arrangements.
You have to do it that way.
And we can do it as a local government, and so that's why we had to do that extra TEFRA hearing. We had to do that. Anthony, you want to add about these market and the premiums?
Yeah, let's talk about the market, and is there another structure we should look at, such as interest only for the first 5 years? It pushes more,
right, and
pushes
just for
more
your
into later, but the rate would drop.
Yeah, Anthony, I have included the entire packet, right? So you can just refer to the page number, but they have all the information.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'll address those questions. So on the structure, we certainly do not need to put principal in every year. For the purpose of the packet that I provided, it was just a level debt service structure, very simply put together just for comparison's sake. If there were a reason to push off principal into later years, we can certainly do that, targeting lower interest rates if that's something you wanted to look at. Like any loan, if you're not amortizing principal, if you think about this as a loan, if you're not amortizing principal at the early end, you're going to pay more interest over time. We may effectively get a lower rate just because of the inverted yield curve, but you still will pay a larger amount of principal if you're not, if you do push off that principal into later years. The Treasury curve is very inverted, as I'm sure you all know. The municipal curve, if you're looking at the pricing summary on that packet of the bond numbers that I had sent, is not quite as inverted as the Treasury yield curve. And I'm going to pull up my pricing summary separately so I can look at what it is. So I have rates ranging starting in 25 starting at 3.3, dropping to about 3.05 just in the first 2 years, and then rising back up. So it's really just those first 2 years where you see the inversion right now, 25 and 26, 24 also if we were to have put a maturity in there, but I did not assume one just because I'm assuming kind of a mid-year issue. As far as the premium and the 5% coupons, love these lights that turn off on their own. As far as the premium and the 5% coupons, that is an estimate that I put together based on the market right now. And so typically the way the city has sold bonds in the past is we've gone through a competitive sale process, which means we prepare the offering document, send it out to the market, and have underwriters bid on the issue. So the only way we will have in that method of sale to dictate the terms is by putting limitations on what the underwriters can bid, which we do. We put kind of outside limitations. However, a 5% coupon, especially on a transaction like this, if we were to do upwards of 10 to 30 million, is very common right now. We're seeing smaller coupons in the longer end. And as you had mentioned, to you, the amount really it works out evenly in that if you're getting this big premium, we're going to then turn around and issue less in par amount of bonds because we're generating a premium with the 5% coupons. But that is something that's bid to us. So those interest rates are bid. We accept the bid that came in with the lowest true interest cost, which is a calculation of their rate and the fee that they propose as underwriter.
I have a question. So going back to the Robert Crown 501c3 bonds, you know, we also have done this big project with the pet shelter. Is there advantages to issuing 501c3 bonds that we could take advantage of with that project? And you know, what are the stipulations around that? I'm not very familiar with those.
So if you're going to issue bonds on behalf of a 501c3, there is no benefit in terms of what rate you're getting if they're going to be a general obligation of the city. So if you're doing it for a project that happens to be a 501c3, that is what dictates them being 501c3 bonds. If you're doing it for a city project, we don't have to go through the TEFRA hearing and get those bonds qualified as 501c3 bonds. Ultimately, though, if they're general obligations of the city.
So who's the obligor on a 501c3, like with Robert Crown?
So, Hitesh, remind me what bonds, because I'm looking at the whole schedule. What bonds are the Robert Crown bonds?
2018A and 2019A bonds, and we were advised by the Chapman and Cutler to issue the 501c3, do the TEFRA hearing, because under our contracts we have accepted the donation. In return, we have allocated some, ice time to them, that they can use that. And because of that, we were advised to kind of go through that route, yeah. 18A and 19A.
So can I suggest, if we want to talk about our ability to pass through our financing costs to a 501c3, maybe we have that in another discussion.
I just want to understand what's on our balance sheet.
I think it is. It's a way for us to pass along our economics, which are benefited by the tax-free status, to a charity.
And in the 18A and 19A case, those were general obligations of the city. So the obligor is the city that's paying those. It's not. There is then, you can also do a pass-through where you are not paying. You're just doing it as a pass-through.
Yeah, I was just curious if maybe that'd be a good way to finance the pet shelter, if there's advantages to that.
I think we're saying the economics don't change for us. If that were a separate charity, we could get them our financing. It sounds like we would then be on the hook. But regardless, that's our facility, right? So anyway.
But wait, I'm sorry. I just have one question on that. So, but the city is not a 501c3.
No,
but yet
not at all.
We issued ourselves a 501c3, 40 million in 501c3 bonds, correct?
No, we're issuing municipal
general
bonds,
obligation
bonds,
bonds,
GL bonds, right?
But we had to do the TEFRA hearing because of these things, because of the contracts and the time allocated, and when we received the donations from Northwestern and some of the others. So that's how we were advised by the bond council.
Okay, just to be clear, though,
we as to why we even
used
it, went through that. I'm just curious if there wasn't an advantage.
No, we had to do that in that sense because we got the advantage we got was the donations we received, and in return we allocated that ice time.
But I think Leslie's making the point that we're getting donations also for the pet shelter. It is a little confusing why a city would issue itself. If I know, like we did for the Montessori, that made perfect sense because they're a third-party nonprofit.
So if I could say that's not the topic we're discussing now, right? Let's try to get through our recommendation on the sizing and timing of this bond issuance. So I personally believe you've done what we've asked, which is to minimize the amount of the bond. The water side is, funded not by property taxes, but by the water fees. And it's a reasonable amount that you're asking, particularly in light of what has been retired over the last 3 years. If we don't issue these bonds, the amount of money that we've spent is going to need to come back into the general fund, and we'll just deplete those reserves. So my view would be I'm comfortable going now, and I think the size is reasonable.
And do it all now.
I would do it all now because we have recurring needs, and we'll likely be back in the market in, this time next year at another amount to be determined. But particularly because the water program is ongoing, it will require normal issuance of bonds that will be paid for by the rate increases. And those rate increases anticipated additional bonds being issued. So it's not all incremental to what we do here. So is there any other? So we don't have, actually the wording of what, are you asking for a vote here or just the input?
It is for the action item, but we just kept it like if you see right here, yeah, the direction is the timing and the amount, or the use of line of credit in case you thought that, okay, no, we would like to have you the money, but not via GO bonds, but yeah, I'd rather use, so that's why your recommendation could be yes, if you're going through the GO bonds, the amount and the timing.
Yeah.
So if I could just summarize what I think I've heard tonight. Use of line of credit, the answer of this committee is no, we don't think that's a good idea. True statement. Timing and amount of GO bonds, I think the consensus is yes, the entire amount does need to be bonded out. Chair Livingston says do it all now. Member McMillan, if I heard you correctly, you thought it might be worth holding off on some of it for a while. Right, so I'd like to answer that question, and once we have that answer, then our discussion is done. Unless the mayor wants to throw in a thought or two.
Just as the person who's going to be chairing the meeting on the receiving end of this, I would love a vote on something.
Right. So, I mean, I'd like to answer the question about do we do it all now, or do half now and half in 6 months? Answer that, then take a vote, make it official.
Chair, I'd like to get Anthony's opinion on that, if we should do some now and some in 6 months.
Yeah, sure. I would not try to get 2 issues done within 6 months. I think it adds additional costs and staff time to get 2 bond issues done. If there's not a meaningful change in interest rates, I mean, we're not going to see a difference than if you were to do it just all at once. There's other considerations, including the investment of those proceeds as you put them back into the account to reimburse yourself, that you're going to earn interest on those proceeds that you're going to lose over 6 months. So if you were to say, you know, hey, let's split this out over a longer period of time, I think there's more of a consideration there. But I would not try to push 2 issues in 6 months.
So I will make a motion to authorize Hitesh to do 1 issue for the full amount.
Second.
Okay. So we have
Any discussion?
any discussion on that point? Okay. So we can go ahead and vote on that point?
All right, we'll start with voting online. Councilmember Kelly,
No.
Committee Member Rikus,
Yes.
Councilmember Burns. Aye. Aye. Thank you. Committee Member McMillan,
No.
Councilmember Wynn. Aye. Councilmember Nusma.
Aye.
Chair Livingston.
Aye.
6-2 in favor.
Okay. Very good. Thank you for that discussion and
5-2. Thank you.
I did have just a quick, if I can. It just for the people who voted no, I understand how somebody can get to a point where they're just no in principle to issuing bonds, but in a situation where there are consequences to not finding money to, make certain improvements, it's necessary that we do something. And so I just would appreciate between now and when we discuss this at council, if you can just clarify, what do you think the city should be doing? If you don't want us to issue bonds, what should we be doing? And I'm not expecting you as one person to have the solution, but even if you have a recommended process where we would determine how we can handle funding, CIP, et cetera, that would be helpful. But again, I think there's a reason why the members of this committee were selected. Your input is important to us, and so I don't want to get into this pattern that I've seen in Evanston where folks just reflexively kind of vote against things, and then as long as it's a majority, we move on. Like, I want to know, is there something that we're missing? And if so, let's figure out the right way to discuss that. I'm not saying that's here tonight, but how do we get there?
I'm happy to answer the question. I think we need to have a much better handle on CIP. What we really need. I don't think we spent nearly enough time on that. I don't think we need to issue all the bonds at once, would be my view. I do think rates are going to come down later. So those are three kind of salient issues for me.
I appreciate that. Thank
Sure,
you.
absolutely, Bobby.
And hopefully that's helpful to the chair as well.
I concur.
Yeah.
I think he wanted to declare who's the other no vote, so I don't know.
Sure. Member Kelly?
Yeah, so I concur with Leslie. I have deep concerns about the way we're spending money that isn't being vetted properly through the public. I think we're often spending large sums of money that don't reflect the interest. So I am concerned about our CIP budget. I'm concerned about our budgeting in general. I've expressed this at I'm not going to, go through the whole, we had interviews and, I expressed my concerns then. So, but essentially, what Leslie said. And by the way, I know at my interview, you mentioned you would also have interviews with the resident experts on the Budget and Finance Committee. Is that happening also as part of the process of collecting information?
Councilmember Kelly is referring to a process that we're going through on the overall budget where we're meeting individually with each member of the City Council. And during Councilmember Kelly's interview, we suggested involving this committee in the process too. Right now we're collecting feedback from the City Council. We're going to reflect on that and decide on what next steps are accordingly. But we're working through those interviews with City Council, and we'll finish those this week, and we'll aggregate the data we get from those meetings. We've simply been asking for feedback on our budget process and ways to improve it.
Thank you.
All right, so the next item for discussion, which does tie into this, is how do we get more input or more of a heads up really on unbudgeted capital projects, but also significant cost overruns. And so, Laura, thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Laura Biggs. I'm the city engineer. So this request came to me to provide more information on unbudgeted costs, and so I provided that in the memo, and I'll summarize it in this presentation. When I looked at our capital program and thought, how do unbudgeted costs happen, I identified essentially 5 types of unbudgeted costs that occur where we can get into significant cost overruns on projects. The thing to note is that the high cost ones are much more likely to occur on really large capital projects. Those projects are complex, and so often when things are going down, it is, as a percentage of the project, it is a small percentage change, but because the project is large, it comes up as a high number. And so what seems like would be perfectly tolerable for that kind of error or change to happen on a $300,000 project, by the time you're at an $8 million project, it's the same level of error, but now it's a big number to deal with. So I looked at the schedule for if, as these costs happen or these changes happen, what would it take to review it with the Finance and Budget Committee? But depending on the timing of that, it does add a delay of 4 to 8 weeks before to the approval processes that we would normally go through. So that delay has some pretty significant impacts depending on what's causing the unbudgeted cost. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with this mouse. I'm not used to doing it this way. No, it's fine. So the first type of overrun is when we have a contract award. We open bids and voila, the cost is just a lot higher than we expected. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's simply a question of during the design, after we established a budget, but during the design we identified additional scope that was needed, and so that creep extended the cost. Usually on large projects, we try to be pretty thoughtful about bringing those known scope creep items to the city council, but it sometimes gets away. Sometimes it's just market forces. There's been a lot of inflation, labor is limited, there's supply chain issues, and sometimes it really is just the availability of contractors. In years when the tollway issues contracts for constructing 294, all of a sudden all of our transportation costs go up. And that isn't necessarily something that we can control as city engineers. So that 4 to 8 week delay, basically there's a couple way it impacts, but the primary is that contractors are generally required in our contracts to hold their price for 60 days. So depending on when the bid opening is, that we bump up against the 60-day requirement. And for that reason, it opens us up into potential changes. Now, that isn't a usual thing. Normally, we can move it through the process pretty quickly. It's a potential that it could happen. But now here would be a case where I was looking at this. And this covers the second reason why it becomes a challenge, and that is that our construction season is slotted for kind of a 6-month period, May through October. And once we start implementing that delay of 4 to 8 weeks, we sort of shift things in the construction season, which can have unintended consequences. So here's an example of how our water main projects typically work. You know, we develop the budget in the previous year, we do the survey. Our water main projects are largely designed by in-house staff. Those staff are supervising the previous year's water main projects up through November. So they don't really start designing the water main projects until November. It takes a certain amount of time to design them, get the permits from IEPA, put it out to bid, and then we have a bid opening on April 9th. So I used April 9th this year and then I looked at your committee date where it is relative to the city council dates, and you can see what starts to happen, that we get to a place where we are essentially creating a 6-week delay by the time we can get to the next council meeting after a finance and budget meeting, and that then results in a substantial shift to the overall schedule. So it takes about a month to set up contracts. So now we're at June 28th instead of May 15th. It takes 5 to 6 months to install the water main, to resurface the streets. We usually do a number of blocks in the project. And then we hit up against the schedule. It's not just weather, although it is weather dependent, but resurfacing has to be done when asphalt plants are open. Asphalt plants close, depending on the weather, around the end of November. At that point, we are done resurfacing, regardless. And so if we shift the schedule, we run into the potential of missing our final completion dates. So there we go. So this results in this kind of situation where now all of a sudden we have to do temporary patching, maintain the job site over the winter, demobilization for the contractor, remobilization for the contractor. If this is a city-caused delay, then we are liable for the cost. So on a water main project, which is typically around $7 to $8 million right now, it creates over winter delays creates like $100,000 to $300,000 cost differential that the city would then have to pay. So this would not always happen, but it is a potential that we would want to look out for. Typically, we'd be able to get that water main installed, but then we would have to do a temporary patch over the trench. And that would probably be okay. We would be smart enough not to mill the street as a whole. but we would do a more substantial patch than we would do if we were going to turn around and mill the street and resurface it. So there's additional cost for patching. I am sorry, I'm not good at this today. Okay, next slide. We do have a subset of transportation projects that where we have an entirely different problem that is actually a lot more substantial and a lot more likely to catch us up. Some of our largest transportation projects are state and federally funded with grants for at least a portion of the cost. And these include like Sheridan Road bike lanes, Howard Street corridor improvements that were done a couple of years ago, the Central Street Bridge. And those are typically, we get a grant that has a cost share, and that allows us to afford these very large projects. But our cost share will still be several $1 million. And once the grant is capped and exhausted, any extra cost comes down to the city of Evanston. However, with these projects, we manage the design contract, but the construction contract is actually done through the Illinois Department of Transportation. And they're not always the most flexible people to work with. They're managing a large number of projects statewide. So when it comes to the construction, they're actually bidding the contract. Next slide. The causes for why we might have cost overruns are just very similar to our own challenges. But in this case, what happens is they open the bid, there's a big cost overrun. They then, or even if there isn't, once they open the bid, they turn to us and say, are you good with us awarding it? And they give us about a week to make that decision. And the way that we manage this process currently, and this is the state of Illinois approved process, is that we have the city council approve a resolution allowing us to enter into the contract with IDOT. And the city manager becomes the decision maker on that contract. So when we get the like go, no go decision point, it is up to the city manager to make that choice. I am not trying to throw City Manager Stowe under the bus. I have yet to meet a city manager that's really comfortable with just shouldering the burden of huge cost overruns without informing the city council about it. But fundamentally speaking, this is how it works legally. And so at that point, if we choose not to award it, then that contract's not awarded. It takes 3 to 6 months to get on to another bid letting. If we rebid a project with no changes, it pretty much is always just more expensive. If you're going to make a substantial change, just because of the approval process you go through with IDOT on the plans and specifications, you're likely to even have a longer delay. IDOT is very slow, for lack of a better word, to get through the whole planning, design, bid process. So when we get a grant award, there are deadlines that we're trying to meet, and we are always right at the end of those deadlines because of the time for IDOT's reviews that are built in. So we would jeopardize our grant award funding in this case if we delay the bid, awarding the bid. That is not to say we haven't done it. We have done it in the past, but it is really unusual. Next slide. So these are, we're getting kind of long here in the meeting, so I just did a similar thing to this. There's also a cost to doing the award or canceling the project. By the time we get to this point, this is what we've done. We have already invested of Evanston money, $500,000 to $1.5 million into the project. So to just cancel it is a decision that can be made, but it's not a decision to be made lightly. Next slide. But then we run into a situation where usually we worked out the grant, so we only owe another $1.5 million to $3 million on the final construction. However, even just delaying it without making a substantial scope change and rebidding it pushes it a construction year. And again, we run into those same market forces and additional engineering costs, and we've all of a sudden spent another several $100,000 without an appreciable benefit. Next slide. So that sort of covers when we open the project and the costs are really high. The next thing that happens that causes cost overruns are when we undergo substantial change orders during construction. There are roughly 4 major causes of change orders: design errors and omissions, where an engineer has made a faulty assumption or not detailed something properly; a modification to the scope of work, which is usually something that is owner-driven. As we're building something, we see something that needs to be addressed, and we ask them to incorporate that into the project. There's a group of things that I would call out of the control of the contractor, but there are supply chain issues, workforce and labor issues, there's a strike, there's significant weather and/or act of God, where all of a sudden there's a lot of damage to the project or a significant delay. But the fourth one is always the tricky one, which is unforeseen conditions. This happens a lot in underground work and in facilities work where we're opening up walls and ceilings and finding stuff that isn't readily apparent to view when we're putting the project together through design. When you're in construction, particularly on unforeseen conditions, you end up having to make decisions very quickly, or you start racking up costs in that way. Next slide. So I will give you some examples just to say how we have to make decisions quickly. So on our 36-inch transmission main, this is actually a project that had a high number of change orders on it, although as a percentage of the contract cost, it was around 5% overall, which is actually a pretty reasonable standard for the industry. But they were lining some sections of water main, they're excavating trenches in other sections. They're excavating a trench, they hit an intersection, and they start excavating across, and there are a number of utilities that had not been properly documented by the agencies that own those utilities. So this is not the fault of a contractor. The agencies didn't necessarily have good records. So ComEd and Nicor, AT&T, and they're all directly in the path of the water main. A 36-inch water main is a large diameter. And anytime you have a fitting to bend the water main, it is a significant cost just because of the sheer weight of the steel and iron that you're using in that fitting. So a decision, I mean, we're standing there with a crew of 4 people, a site superintendent, an excavator, a dump truck, and it's like, what are we going to do? Contracts are actually set up to require the contractor to move forward in good faith, even if they don't have a solution. However, we would like to be part of that decision. And so often we're making choices right there, not knowing the cost of adding all of those fittings, but figuring that is our best choice at the moment. If we did not make the choice and told them to shut down, we would be liable for the cost for the day, demobilization, remobilization. It's not clear when we would be able to get them back on site. That by itself could be a tricky thing if they start sending crews to other jobs and working on them. So in the end, that one item on this project ended up being $163,000, and obviously that is something we would prefer to have the City Council's decision on. It is not the city's commitment until the City Council votes. That's very clear in the contract, but contractors, if they hear that the City of Evanston does not honor these commitments, will start getting much more shy about doing work or doing it up front like this and working in good faith. We had a similar thing on the water plant intake just this past summer. They're installing sheet piling. There is a giant concrete slab 5 feet under the sand. Who knows why? We still don't understand what that was about. They had to remove 10 feet of it, and that cost was $155,000. So same exact situation, same exact judgment call. In these cases, I've generally found it is better to make a decision knowing it may not be perfectly correct than it is to try to shut down the project. Our next category, emergency repair projects. So these are projects where we have a failure of critical infrastructure that would prevent us from delivering the appropriate services. So the city manager does have purchasing authority in emergencies. Again, city managers tend to like to have the backing of the city council. I haven't worked for one yet that's really happy with just like going forward and spending $100,000 without any coverage. So, but typically right away the staff starts working on mitigating that repair, getting quotes from contractors or engineers, getting people started on doing work. Pretty quickly, we immediately notify City Council. We pretty quickly bring a resolution to grant us the authority to keep moving forward. and we implement the work. But at the time when we start, it is not known what the costs are going to be. We just start. Next slide. Some examples of emergency projects, and I will tell you, not all of these were very expensive, and we knew doing them they weren't going to be very expensive, but they all had to be done, in the staff's opinion, right away. We had to start dealing with it. So Lincoln Street Bridge has having an ongoing problem with structural deterioration. We're just starting the project to replace it, but IDOT gave us a notice of 30 days to shore up the beams underneath the bridge or shut down Lincoln Street until it was fixed. Civic Center boiler stairs, the boiler building out there has an apartment that we rent to a private citizen.
I think you have some really good examples of why it's impractical.
Yes.
Maybe we could get to some discussion. Right.
Non-emergency unbudgeted projects, which I think is probably part of the focus of what we're talking about in those cases. Yeah. It depends on why the project's being happened.
Thank you.
That's sort of the end.
So I understand the difficulty. I think what this committee would want is just, we're an advisory committee. When you believe you're headed towards and we can set the scope, a material overrun on a project, doesn't have to be the exact amount. And if it's, when feasible, that could be brought to this committee to be discussed in a general way so that things don't hit the city council when they could have been discussed beforehand. And our committee is just a way to socialize the issue where possible when you know that there is a material unbudgeted item or cost overrun. Obviously, if there's some sort of emergency, but if we set the number at whatever, let me say for now, $500,000, you suspect this project is headed towards a $500,000 overrun roughly, and here are the issues. We would be a good committee we're not approving it, but for that issue to be discussed and socialized so that it doesn't hit the city council and have to be acted on that night, right? If it's possible, given the nature of it, you run into some horrible emergency situation, and we don't work for, we don't have another committee meeting for 3 weeks, then the city council is the approving body in any case. But where it's feasible on whatever the number is, material overrun, we are a mechanism to at least get that socialized before it hits the city council so that people can start asking questions and any news coverage can talk about it if it's that significant. That is my thought. So, Jonathan?
Just one more thing. Next slide. Oh, you got it. So there are some things that we have done in the past or that we feel like are generally good practices because we did do some discussion about this. And one thing that is more common in the past, particularly when the bonds were sold more upfront and then there's a fixed amount of money and that money there's no wiggle room on it, was to really look at when these emergencies happen, figuring out where we can lower the budget in the same fund to accommodate those costs so that there is not necessarily a net impact. Now, it's not always possible, but it's pretty much 99% possible, I would say. And that practice we haven't been doing as much lately publicly. We've been doing it more privately, but we feel like that would be a reasonable thing and probably should be implemented and something to bring more forward. And then this is actually, that just says, especially in those situations where we cannot identify a subsequent reduction, it feels like it should be brought to this committee to have that discussion about how are we going to deal with this in the way that makes the most long-term sense for the community.
So, Jonathan, your light's on for a comment.
I'm going to run through these all really quick, category by category. So higher than budgeted project costs at the time of contract award. That happens sometimes. We budget X and the project bids come out for X plus something. It also happens that we bid X and the contract, the bids come back and they're below what we budgeted. So over time, do those tend to balance themselves out?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of it depends on how conservative we are in setting the budget, but then you run the risk of you can't do as many projects that are needed because you've overestimated the projects you have. So, but yes, and again, if you think of the year's budget and the bond issue as a fixed number, then that is actually something you sort of have to average out. If you can't average it out, then you end up delaying a project in order to pay for it, which we have done in the past.
Right. A lower priority project will come off of the bottom of the list because we have to do the top ones.
Yes. And I will say that part of the reason the last couple years, inflation has been in construction has been so crazy that it actually has been very difficult. It's been not a normal situation where it would be very challenging for us to be able to even try to manage that. But it was coupled with the advantage of ARPA funds and high general fund reserves. But normally, I would say it would be much more typical.
The question in front of us right now is what
them.
role, if any, does this committee play in managing these? So I think this committee maybe should be informed, but I don't know if we need to weigh in, because what value are we going to add to, the underground construction? That's not the expertise of this committee. State and federally funded projects, kind of the same there. I don't want to delay things because, as you pointed out, that in and of itself adds cost. And so having things routed through this committee, I'm not sure what value that adds. Same for change orders during construction, which you need to act quickly on. We can't delay that process anymore. And emergency projects, by their very nature, can't wait for a committee to weigh in on. The one area where I think it does make sense for this committee to have some input is the non-emergency unbudgeted projects. And that's, let's just call it what it is. I think the Little Beans acquisition is what precipitated this conversation. I think for something like that, it is entirely appropriate to bring that to this committee. So that's my quick take.
I guess then how are we ever going to have any checks and balances? And I guess, one of the reasons why I joined this committee was, just having sat through what happened with Robert Crown, which, was a wonderful asset to the city. At the same time, it was just like, oh, it's 10 million more, 10 million more, 10 million more. It was sort of like, where does it stop? I mean, where is there sort of a, hey, we have to sit down and maybe cut something or delay it or something? Similarly, I have people ask me, they seem to think I have some influence over District 65, which I don't, which you're looking at, huge cost overruns on that school. Where does this end? Where do the residents finally get to say, enough? And it seems like, we're just talking about kind of, well, we'll socialize things. But at some point, there needs to be a check and balance, and we need to say, we have a budget and we stick to it. I've had the opportunity to talk to people in Skokie, talk to council members and staff in Glenview, talk to council members and staff in Wilmette. They stick to their budgets. How is it we're struggling to do that? I guess I just don't understand it.
Well, I think that what we do is we look at the fund level. And we work to stay in budget on the fund level. And there are occasions when, like I said, there are these surprises which have happened a lot in the last couple of years. But also when you reference something like Robert Crown, where there was a substantial increase in the scope over time for that project. And then those things were brought to the city council and reviewed with them, and choices were made. So.
And I really appreciate that, your explanation. However, at the same time, I think as we have huge cost overruns on things, like you knew full well we were talking about, moving into, the lease on that, on the building well in advance of having our meeting the last time we had a meeting. And I think what this committee needs to do, or what I view as our one of the things that we can add value is, okay, we're going to have these cost overruns. These are going to be expensive. How's that going to affect our budget? How's it going to affect our surpluses? How's it going to affect our bond rating? And I feel like if that's not what we're doing, then we're not really holding up our fiduciary duty here. If it's just socializing things and saying, well, it seemed like a lot, I don't know. It it doesn't seem like we have much teeth.
Sherry also had her hand up, I believe.
Yeah, I agree with Jonathan. Things like CIP projects that were not approved, that just come to the council without us, and maybe we, say a $2 million project like Little Beans, would have been nice for us to discuss. But the question I have, and Laura, thank you for that presentation, and I do understand there's a lot of decisions and emergencies that need to be made on the spot, but how many of those are over 500,000 or over $1 million? Because the examples you showed us were, a few $100,000. Would it be practical to set a limit? If a project overruns by $1 million or $2 million, it comes to our committee. How often does that really happen?
So it doesn't happen very often, but it most frequently happens on those IDOT projects. So that's one of the challenges, because of the size. They're large projects, so if it's 10% over, then that ends up being a much bigger number than if we're talking about we're purchasing a piece of playground equipment, it's $100,000.
But if I could say for IDOT, that's generally a shared expense, right?
Sometimes.
Or would the overrun be on the city or on the state?
Overruns are on the city.
Okay. I mean, we can always, if we set a scope, you could say, hey, we need to have a conference call, something. Anyway.
Well, that was another, David, real quick, another idea I had is maybe overruns over a certain amount need the city manager, the treasurer, and one person from our committee approval, which could be a quick approval, and then, we would delegate someone from our committee. So that was just another idea I had.
And answering the other part of on these emergency repairs, as well as the change orders, part of the challenge is when we start trying to fix something, we don't necessarily know how much it's going to cost. We've been working on the structural failure at the police fire headquarters, and I still don't, that's been going on for 8 months, and I still don't have the final cost for it. I have a much better cost than I used to have as we've entered into contracts, we've narrowed down the problem, we've figured it. And so the reason I put the number of vendors on this table is you can see Fire Station 4, with the roof going out and having to be replaced, that ended up being around $400,000. In today's dollars, that would be over $500,000, but I had no way of knowing that the moment it started.
Claire has her hand up, and look, do you know of any over $500,000 unbudgeted or cost overruns at the moment?
No,
I don't think this is a problem we have to solve tonight. I think we would like to know, but let's see what Claire has to say.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, so I think, David, you had a proposal in the past, I think that was to bring to us, I think you said 500,000. I think that makes sense, and of course, if there's an emergency, that would go straight, as a special order of business. That's what special orders of business would be for, right, to spend beyond our budget. And I just want to point out, we do have a tradition routinely of amending the budget. And that's because we do exceed not funds within the funds, but the funds that are legally established. And so we are legally obligated to amend every single year. And it would be a really great year one year if we came in at budget or below. I think that is something that would be great to strive for. Other cities do it. So I would like to see us do that. And I do think that this committee is a committee that is, in a sense, checks and balances. And I think if we do set that limit, whether it's 500,000, whatever we set it at, I think that's important. I think it's important for residents to know that there is this venue that's focused on that. But in addition to setting that amount, an amount that would exceed a fund budget, we should also look at when we're adopting new budgets, line items that exceed a certain percent. In that case, I would say a percent. So, and I don't know what that would be, but I think when we see a big jump in a line item, there should be a justification for it. Maybe if it exceeds 20%. So I would like to just throw that in there as well. Thank you.
So I think we've taken this discussion enough for tonight. I think it ultimately is what the council wants in terms of an additional avenue to have discussion on major overruns and unbudgeted items so that there can be discussion on it, but ultimately it's what the city council wants to do. It seems reasonable to me that when you have a rough idea, I think that the police and fire building, these changes could add roughly $500 to $1 million, right? And these are the problems, and you come here and you talk about it. At least that gives everyone a heads up. This is coming. It doesn't have to be exact, but it could be, we have an unbudgeted item here that was probably going to be developed over the next 3 to 4 months. And when that is possible. So, at any rate, is there any more discussion on this point tonight?
As we're talking about this, it occurs to me there's a difference between, this committee kind of being informed on what's going on and coming to this committee for approval or recommendation to council. And, I certainly would like this, I think there's a role for this committee to be informed when things are getting out of whack on the police and fire headquarters, for example. But I don't necessarily think this committee needs to weigh in on every single thing that doesn't go exactly according to budget.
So I'm just trying to wrap up here. So should the staff then sort of develop a more formal policy to bring back here to the committee for review?
I think that's a good idea, and the council members can decide, do you think that that is helpful? Again, telling us is telling the community, right, before it is presented at a council meeting and voted on. That's the point, where it's practical to do that. So, but I think it's up to the council members. What do you want the scope of this? What sort of heads up, here's some unbudgeted capital, or major cost overruns. What do you want this committee's responsibility to be?
And it could just be, just spitballing, quarterly reports on our CIP. And, here's where we're on track, here's where we're trending slightly over, here's where we're trending slightly under. And heads up, there's something, a big scary monster behind this corner that we don't know what it's going to be.
So with that,
may I just make? I just think there's absolutely nothing wrong with us making a non-binding recommendation. I think that gives, that means we've discussed it. That's all that means. So we say, yes, we heard it, we're good with that, we recommend it on to council. It's non-binding, just like the Land Use Commission is a focus group. It makes recommendations. The council can take it or leave it. But at least that sort of formal process, it gives us assurance that checks and balances. We have heard it, we've discussed it, and we've approved. We've said, okay, that makes sense. That's all. I don't think it's need to go to council for a whole discussion.
I completely agree for the category of non-emergency unbudgeted projects.
So why don't we leave this in our next meeting? Maybe the staff can think about what you think would be workable, and we don't have to go, we understand all your limitations of formality here. What do you think is workable? And we can discuss, hopefully briefly, do we think that's enough? Is that okay? All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, I think we can go, I think we do not need to go back over the loss factor. We could do that. We could table that again. And, okay, sorry. Anything else? Did Hitesh have anything else? Otherwise.
No, Mayor is here. I wanted to thank you for the role you served as a chair. It's very critical. And I think we had those kind of turbulent times, and so, we, as the chief financial officer, I really sincerely thank you for keeping the things on track. And still, one of those big achievements, we can always talk about the pension funding policy. And so, we sincerely appreciate your help, your time, while working in the senior position with your company. So, again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hitesh. And I'll obviously still be here. So. All right. Okay, you're welcome. All right. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.